One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains economics, politics and policy in plain English. I'm Jennifer Macy, producer of Follow the Money, and I'm filling in for our regular host Ebony Bennett, who's away sick this week. We know that Australia is in the middle of a housing crisis, but according to Anglicare's 2024 rental affordability snapshot, it's the worst it's ever been.
Across Australia, house prices are near record levels.
Housing shortage has plunged from a crisis to a catastrophe.
That virtually zero rental properties across the country are now affordable for low-income Australians.
A new report from the charity Anglicare has found it's never been harder to find an affordable rental, especially for low-income earners.
That there are millions of renters and mortgage holders choosing between feeding their kids or making that rent or mortgage payment, and the best they can do is offer them scraps. Meanwhile, they're giving property investors $175 billion.
It's impossible to do your homework as a young kid if you are living in a car.
I have a question for the government. Just how many videos do I have to do of rental properties having their ceilings literally fall in on top of the occupants until we do something about this?
Wants negative gearing gone, job seeker boosted, and federal government built affordable housing.
It's beyond time that we stopped asking the private rental market to do the heavy lifting in affordable housing.
Of the 45,000 properties surveyed, less than 300, or 0.6%, were affordable for someone earning a full-time minimum wage. And only 3 share houses were affordable for someone on job seeker. And if you're on youth allowance, there was 0 properties for you. It's also grim for people looking to buy a house, with house prices growing faster than wages for decades. Yet despite the talk from all levels of government to fix the problem, it's getting worse. In this webinar, Australia Institute Deputy Director Ebony Bennett and Senior Economist Matt Grudnoff are joined by Jordan van der Berg, a lawyer and the creator of shitrentals.org, or otherwise known as Purple Pingers on social media, and Maiy Azize, the national spokesperson for Everybody's Home, which is a national campaign to fix Australia's housing crisis.
Welcome to you all. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Eb.
Thank you.
Maiy, I just wanted to start with you. A lot of the figures I just cited are from Anglicare, but can you tell us about the kind of scope of the problem that Australians are facing when it comes to finding affordable housing today?
I think it almost feels like a cliche to say that it's never been worse, but truly it's never been worse. You talked about that statistics, 0.6% of rentals being affordable for someone on the minimum wage. Since I started, my day job is at Anglicare Australia, and since I've been here in 2017, 0% of rentals have been affordable for someone on the job seeker payment, 0% on youth allowance, 0% on disability support pension, which isn't surprising if you can't afford to rent on a full-time minimum wage. It's not a real shock that you can't afford to rent if you're out of work or struggling in some other way. But the thing that's been really interesting to see and really sad to see is that when I first started, people earning the minimum wage could afford about 10% of rentals. It's now down to less than 1%. So you can see we've had a really big change in just the last decade alone. We've got 10% rent increases coming through just about every single year on average. And if you look at the SQM data, on average asking rents, it's gone up by about 75% since the start of the pandemic, which is epic. I don't know anybody who's had a 75% wage increase. The pension hasn't gone up by 75%, job seeker, DSP, you name it, minimum wage. None of these things are going up by anywhere near the amount that we're seeing rent increases go up by. Everybody's Home campaign has just been, we're in the middle of doing this People's Commission into the housing crisis. And we had hearings in Sydney where we were talking to people about their experiences. And we just heard real despair from really average people having really average experiences. You know, we heard from people who have had to move with their children every single year for the past decade, take their kids out of school because they're just being consistently priced out of the areas that they live in. Their kids don't even believe them when they say, oh, we're not going to move anymore, we found a home. We've had people, you know, talking to us about that in tears. On the other end of the spectrum, you know, for older people, when you're a renter and you're retiring into this rental system on a really fixed income, we heard from people saying literally that they hope their life ends because they can't afford to retire and they're finding it tough to find rooms in share houses at their age and, you know, being discriminated against by landlords and prospective housemates and things. And we also hear from people who are kind of just grateful to live in the homes they live in. We heard from an international student who migrated to Australia from the Philippines 5 years ago, and he lives in what the Daily Telegraph calls the smallest rental in Sydney. It's 12 square metres, so it's like the size of a car park. And he was just telling us how grateful he is to have somewhere to live. And he also told us a story about how he once had to go 29 days without eating food, just drinking water, because he was, you know, needing to keep paying the rent and works casually and wasn't getting consistent work, and keeps applying for rentals, keeps applying for affordable rentals, new places to try and live, and can't find them. So we've got a system that isn't working for people. I don't like to say the system is broken. I think the system is working exactly the way it was designed to work, which is to work for people who are investing in housing, and casualties in that are people who need homes to live in.
Yeah, thanks, Maiy. That's some really harrowing kind of testimony that you've got through the People's Commission. Just for people following along, where can people find out about that People's Commission?
Yeah, so if you go onto everybody'shome.com.au, we've got a big tab at the top that says People's Commission. We're really happy to have the Australia Institute participate in that and make a submission to that. I suspect you guys might be featured in our final report. But yeah, we're having some more hearings later in the month that are focused on people who are living in regional areas and First Nations communities. We expect that to be pretty harrowing as well, unfortunately. But yeah, we've just done our face-to-face hearings.
And Jordan, I want to come to you next. You started shitrentals.org. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about what that is and why you felt the need to start it.
Yeah, good question. So shitrentals.org is just like it's pretty much a Google review, but for your house, or your rental, or your real estate agency. I started it because I was, you know, making funny little videos on TikTok about making fun of someone's house effectively. And a lot of people were kind of sending in their houses, and I was going over, having a chat to them, and then kind of making fun of it so that something would get done, and you know, we could see some change from that particular landlord for that particular person's story. But it became too much. Like, there were too many people sending in their homes to be reviewed, and it's also unfair that someone has to go through some white guy on the internet to tell their story. So yeah, that's why the website started. You can review your own rental. You don't have to go through me, and you can, you know, warn other renters, other prospective renters, that, hey, this is what it's actually like to live in this property. Because yeah, when we've got a national vacancy rate of 1%, you're going to have to put up with stuff that you don't like, and they're not going to tell you what that stuff is. So yeah, shitrentals.org is a way to kind of warn people about that. But it's also a way, like, we're using the data from that to, a lot of times when we talk about shit rentals in Australia and like the standard of housing and like landlords and stuff like that, the response from government and the response from, you know, real estate lobbies is to be like, well, it's just a few bad apples and whatever. And like, that saying doesn't even make sense, because a few bad apples spoil a bunch. That's how the saying works. But people are saying, and like even on the project and stuff, you know, aren't these just outliers and stuff like that? So like, it's a way to collect all this data and show that, hey, this isn't a few outliers. These are thousands and thousands of homes in Australia that are objectively shit and can result in deaths if we allow this to continue. So yeah, that's the goal behind shitrentals.org.
And what are some of the kinds of things that people have posted to shit rentals that they're either putting up with or were hidden from them when they were moving into a property or renting a property?
Yeah, so like everything from like basic stuff that I assume most of us would have experienced, like, the landlord just rocking up without notice or anything like that, to like some pretty horrific stuff. And like there's some pretty bad stories on there. I don't even know where to start, but like stories of some pretty extreme racism, to migrant families, to like one person found a shotgun in the wall, and the place was broken into and they didn't find the shotgun, but they broke the wall next to where the shotgun was. Like asbestos is a big one. Black mold, and actually all colors of mold, leaky taps, like just I don't yeah, like anything you can imagine. Like we're paying for the privilege of renting in Australia. It's great. It's good stuff.
And how much has that grown over time, the interest in shit rentals and, people finding out about it and sharing that kind of information?
Yeah, unfortunately, it has grown over time as the vacancy rate gets lower and lower, and landlords get more and more greedy because they can see just how much they can profit from desperate people. Like when you look at the hierarchy of needs, we will sacrifice a lot to have a house that we can live in. And people are sacrificing a lot. People are giving up food, people are giving up medicine so that they can live. And landlords know this, and this is great for them.
Matt Grudnoff, I want to come to you next, because obviously this is an issue that governments at the state and federal level talk about trying to solve all the time. We see things like first home buyers grants, but there's a lot of ways in which we can make housing more or less affordable. What are some of the problems that we currently have that are making this problem worse in terms of policies?
Well, I think the biggest problem is most of the government policies that are claimed to try and make housing more affordable actually make housing less affordable. So, first home buyers grants, basically preferencing one group by giving them more money or allowing them to be able to bid up the price even higher, only makes house prices even higher for everybody. There are basically two ways you can make housing more affordable. You can increase supply. So, if the government went out there and, it reversed its, abandonment of public housing, and it decided to actually go out there and build an enormous amount of public housing, that would make housing more affordable. Or it can decrease demand for housing. And that might seem odd at first, but what I mean is there's been this sort of rush in the last 20 years to invest in housing. For people to think of housing as not a good where, you go and you raise a family and you have security, but rather as an investment, something that'll, build your financial nest egg for the future. And that investment, the creation of that investment demand is actually what's driving house prices higher. May's right that the system is working as intended. So to give you some numbers, 25% of investment properties are owned by 1% of taxpayers. So we have a position now where there's lots of people rushing in to buy 2, 3, 4, or even, 30 odd investment properties, and that's driving up demand. And they've got enormous tax concessions to do this. Things like the capital gains tax discount and needed gearing, those two combined are worth more than $20 billion.
What Matt's talking about is the fact that pretty much since we introduced the capital gains tax discount, which I think was around back in 1999, this problem essentially exploded. We've had negative gearing for a long time, but it's that in combination with the capital gains tax discount that really put this problem on steroids. Hopefully Matt can join us again in a little bit, because I'd like to ask him too about some of the other schemes that we've seen, for example, the Coalition's idea to raid your super to pay for a housing deposit, which I think kind of just replicates some of those existing problems that we can see with the first home buyers grant. Maiy, I wanted to come back to you and ask about how we used to do public and social housing and affordable housing, because it doesn't feel like it's always been this way. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I agree with everything Matt's just said, but I think this issue about the government's role in delivering housing and the tax issue together are really two sides of the same coin. So we used to have an era in Australia where housing was really affordable, several decades, right? And after the Second World War, governments in Australia basically built up, created the idea of public housing, built it from the ground up, and it used to deliver a lot of housing itself. The government used to build a lot of homes to rent to people. It also used to build homes to sell to people. At the height of public housing in Australia, about 1 in 3 renters rented from the government, and about 1 in 4 new builds was being built by the government, right? And 1 in 3 renters was living in housing provided by the government right up until the early 80s. So this played a really big role, not just in keeping housing affordable for the people who lived in those homes, but actually keeping housing affordable for everybody, because the government just had such a big footprint. And all sorts of people used to live in these homes. So public servants, construction workers, teachers, you name it. Once the government started stepping back from providing housing itself, it became a lot harder for people to get social housing. So now to get social housing, you really have to, it's extremely difficult, like just at our People's Commission, we were hearing from people who were on waiting lists of about 10 years. But you basically can't be working. You've got to have some pretty exceptional circumstances going on in your life. Whereas this kind of housing used to be for everybody. So I would say that's the first big thing that the government did to push up the cost of housing in Australia. I totally echo what Matt was saying about tax. I mean, for us, that's really the other side of the coin to our campaign. We're a campaign for more social housing. We're also a campaign for tax reform. We know that when the government introduced the capital gains tax discount and more people started taking up the negative gearing tax deductions, it really changed who landlords are in Australia. So before that, most landlords of Australia were actually positively geared, which means they owned the house that their renter was living in, and you didn't see these 10% rent increases every single year. What we're seeing now is more and more housing is being delivered by these kind of highly leveraged amateur landlords, and we're seeing them behave in really different ways to what we've seen before, and you really can't explain it any other way besides the tax stuff.
I'm just interested in that description of them as amateur landlords. Maiy, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, I sometimes get a bit of pushback from this language. I will say I never use the phrase mum and dad investors. I never, I think it's kind of manipulative language, actually. I say amateur landlords. I think there's downsides to having institutions and people who own multiple homes providing housing, but there are a lot of upsides as well, because we know that when people are negatively geared, they're making a loss. They're really sensitive to things like interest rate increases. They're always trying to maximize the amount of money they're making. They're kind of skirting thin. We know a lot of people don't stay. People who own just one investment property often flip their homes after just a couple of years. So, they aren't approaching it as though they're supplying an essential service. This is another thing I talk about all the time. I'd be really interested in Geordie's perspective on it. Your water provider, like your utilities, electricity providers, they can't just arbitrarily raise prices for no reason, and they can't cut you off very easily. It's like double digits in most states. They need to go back and offer you kind of hardship programs if you haven't paid. They're really tightly regulated. But when it comes to the homes that we live in, we just sort of allow these amateur people to become suppliers of something that's an essential service and provided in this really loose way. Even, the workplaces that we're in, your employers are obliged to make them safe. And if you have an incident at work, WorkSafe would be on site within about half an hour. When it comes to the homes that we live in, it's a shit fight just to get, minimum rental standards like basic insulation. Caps on rent increases only exist really in the ACT. And I think this is all driven by the fact that housing is supplied by small time.
Geordie, I wanted to come to you next just to respond to Maiy in the first instance. That must be exactly the kind of behaviour that you're seeing on ship rentals all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the comparing it to like energy providers is really interesting because we had a look I think it was 2021 or 2022, like gas supplies like artificially reduce the supply of gas, and gas is not a human right. Housing is a human right, and the government was like, "Hey, that's wrong. We're going to force you to supply more gas, and yeah, you can't, we can step in, we can control the price. We have a bunch of these powers, and we're happy to do that as long as you can still keep getting your gas." But then when it comes to housing, we're like, "Oh, that's the market. It's the market," and it's not the market. It's a bunch of landlords being greedy. But that is, I guess, the market. But yeah, so like we know what has to be done here. We've had every state and federal and local councils had an inquiry into the housing crisis, and it's produced a bunch of recommendations from people that are far smarter than me. And they've also all said the exact same thing about, the capital gains tax discount and certain negative gearing aspects and investment in public housing and things like that. And the government has taken up precisely zero of those recommendations, even though they're the answers, and they're just by how many, times they're repeated in those inquiries, we know that they're correct. And yeah, instead, the government solution is to let's give property developers more money. Let's make, let's any solution that they want to propose, whether it's the coalition or it's like Labor, they're like, we're gonna give a solution that increases the price of housing. And that's not correct. That's like, it's already too expensive. That's the problem here. That's the problem we're trying to address. So it's just really frustrating. And then in the meantime, people can't afford to rent, and homelessness increases in Australia. While we have all these solutions already on the table, and they're being presented to people who own investment properties to vote on solutions about their investment properties, that they're like, nah, I don't like this very much. So, we're just going to wait and see what happens, see what the market does and whatever, while people are dying and, renters die from landlords not being screwed to put in a smoke alarm, for example. I've been reading a bunch of coroner's reports about, the real estate agent was like, yeah, there's a smoke alarm, when in reality there was no smoke alarm, and then there was a fire and the renter died. And yeah, stuff like that happens so often, and it's just, I don't know, it makes me really angry, and it's going to get a lot worse before anything happens. So yeah, awesome stuff.
Matt, I'll come again to you about some of the taxation stuff in a second, but Geordie, if I can stay with you and the work that you've been doing around how many vacant homes are around Australia. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we've just got a lot of empty and abandoned houses in Australia. So I've been posting the addresses of some of those houses for people to squat in if you want, because like if you're rich enough to have an investment property lying around that you don't need, then I feel like someone else can use that. Like we shouldn't have homes without people while we have people without homes. That is a ridiculous notion to me. It's also legal in Australia, and it's also how we founded this country, by stealing a bunch of land from Indigenous people. So like, let's do it back to the rich people. It's like this is not a new concept by any stretch of the imagination. It is part of our culture. So yeah, I feel like do it to rich people, let the people have some land back. And yeah, I don't know, a lot of people are angry about it. And maybe if you're angry about it, then don't leave a house abandoned for 15 years.
And you say a lot of people get angry about it. I've seen some of the media interviews that you've done on this, and there is some palpable anger out there from people. But it is just kind of pretty hard to, like, when you talk about the fact that these are people with no roof over their head at all, it's pretty hard to argue against.
No, yeah, exactly. There's two kind of aspects to it. There's this notion that, there's a bunch of people who are aspirational landlords in Australia. And I think it's a culture that we need to fight against. But these people are willing to kind of step in and protect the honor of some random that they don't know, who's hoarding a house and, not letting anyone live there, and kind of creating this tension. Like, you can't do that to someone else's house. It's like, they don't even have, like most circumstances, they don't even have an investment property, let alone a vacant investment property. So I will never understand that. I'll never understand defending the honor of some random rich person you've never met. But then there's the other aspect of, like, when we talk on particularly these panels and we talk to government, we're talking to landlords, generally speaking, and they simply do not understand that people would like a roof over their heads. So when I spoke on the project, I had a bunch of things I wanted to talk about. I wanted to talk about, how you can just connect the electricity back if you want to. Electricity providers don't care who's paying the bills as long as someone is paying the bills. They don't care whether you're the landlord or a tenant or a squatter. But yeah, I wanted to talk about some tips, and then I realized that the conversation was getting to like, oh, is it better to actually live inside than it is outside? And it's like, I can't believe we're at this point in Australia where we have such a big disconnect between the rich and then the rest of us that, we have to talk about whether or not you'd like to live inside. Like, yeah, I don't know. It's nuts.
It's pretty disheartening, and particularly as you and May have been talking about, like the actual problem of homelessness being so difficult. And May, at the moment, I think there's so many people who are in homelessness who have never appeared experiencing homelessness before. Certainly, I know after we've had a lot of natural disasters across Australia, there've been a lot of families whose house burnt down or was flooded, living in tents for months and years after those kinds of things. But it's impacting people who've been, as we said, pushed out of the rental market and other things as well. Matt, I want to come back to you. You were talking about negative gearing and capital gains tax, and but also, what are the other measures that government can do that we know actually make things better and not make things worse?
Yeah, like I said, if you got rid of all the tax concessions, which basically are the benefits that go to investors, that encourage investors into the market, you'd reduce investor demand for housing. So what would happen? Well, less people would show up to house auctions. Less investors would show up to house auctions, which means the price wouldn't go as high, which means you would have more homeowners. So if you took out these investor incentives, you wouldn't decrease the number of housing. There's no investor out there that goes, well, because I'm not, getting my tax concession anymore, I'm going to burn my house down so nobody can have it. No, what they'll do is they'll sell the house and they'll sell it to people who actually want to live in it. And so we'll see home ownership rates up. And the other thing that's really important to know is that, look, if a lot of people rushed in and invested in the stock market, right, in the share market, then look, shares might go through a bubble that they might get overvalued. Whereas if a lot of people rush in to invest in housing, then house prices go up, all right? And that has impacts. That pushes people into poverty, that pushes people into homelessness. So if you're somebody out there who's thinking about what you want to invest in, there are plenty of options of things you can invest in, and maybe housing isn't the thing you should be investing in.
And Matt, the government does invest in public housing, not as much as it used to, but there's other mechanisms that we already use. I'm thinking here of the fact that we build and buy housing for Defence Force personnel. There's not just this model of investing in houses. We actually do purchase them and build them, do we not?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the house, as part of your package in the Defence Forces, working for the Defence Force, they will supply you with housing. So, if the government were to crack down on these tax concessions, as I said, they're worth about $20 billion a year. That would build a lot of housing. We could build housing for nurses. We could build housing for teachers. We could build housing for people. And we could build them in the places where people have jobs, where they want to live, in the communities they want to stay in. Public housing isn't just for really poor people. Even if you will never qualify for public housing adds to the stock of housing. And it reduces the demand for, when it's not there, then more people are demanding those rental properties. And so if you've got people going into public housing rather than the private rental market, then you're reducing the increase in rents. So it helps everybody, except for investors, by the way, because it will stop house prices going up as much as they're currently going up. They're the only losers, that sort of 15% of taxpayers who currently invest in housing.
And I did just want to ask about those interactions, I guess, because we hear a lot of politicians talk about wanting to make housing more affordable, but they never really mean making housing cheaper.
Yep.
But you and I have these discussions all the time in the office. Like a lot of people who invest in housing, they're looking for a capital gain down the track. And people who own their own house are often looking at their house prices going up and thinking, wow, that's great. But what they don't understand necessarily is if house prices keep going up, if they ever want to sell their house, then they have to buy in at that new higher level of house price. I mean, for people who do own their own homes, why does affordable housing and making housing cheaper for people to access make sense for people who own their own homes as well?
Yeah, look, absolutely. So, if house prices go up and you just own the home you live in, that doesn't really benefit you at all. Why doesn't it benefit? Because if you ever sell your house, you might get more for it, as you say, but you've then got to live somewhere. So you've got to buy another house. And that's going to be more expensive. If house prices go down or become more affordable, sure, you won't get as much for your house when you sell it and want to move, but also it'll cost you less to buy the next house that you buy that you live in. So really, it is only people who own houses, investment properties, houses that they don't live in. These are the people who gain from constantly increasing house prices. And the problem with constantly increasing house prices is people see the price constantly going up and they think, wow, that's a great place to get in. I want to invest in that. And so they rush in, which further increases house prices. And this is where this capital gains tax discount and negative gearing, these tax concessions, are encouraging more investors into the market, pushing prices ever higher in order to make bigger and bigger returns. And we've gotten away from the idea that what is a house for? A house is an investment good. It shouldn't be, its primary purpose shouldn't be as an investment good. It should be a place where you raise a family, where you live, where you have security. It shouldn't be about, building a nest egg for the future. As the others have said, a house is a human right. And it's not a human right because it's an investment good. It's a human right because it is so vital for life. And we really need to focus in on that. And that's before about 2000, when the capital gains tax discount came in. That's what housing was. There were some rental properties. Renting is useful. A small stock of rental property is useful. But primarily, housing is about security and not investment. And we need to flip back to that idea that housing is something that people aspire to. They want to own their own home so they can live in it, not own lots and lots of houses so they can make lots of money from it. There are lots of ways you can invest. I'm not against investment as an economist, but there are better and worse investments, and housing in Australia has become over-invested in, and we need to return back to the idea that housing is a consumer good.
Maiy, did you want to respond to that as well?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. We need to move away from the idea that housing is like an asset, an investment, what have you. But I think we need to, the other side of that coin is that we need to return to the idea that it's the government's responsibility to ensure that everybody's got a home. I think, one of the linguistic, changes I've seen over the past kind of 10 years or so is the way homelessness and housing affordability is sort of spoken about like it's a weather system, it's this thing that the government has no control over. It's just something that happens to people, but it's something that government does, right? Government is in control of how affordable housing is. Government is in control of whether every citizen has a home. They used to play a really big role in providing homes. And if we had a major crisis in some kind of area of society, like if we had a huge health crisis or a huge education crisis, we wouldn't be saying that the solution is to bring in a bunch of, private investors. We'd be, really demanding that the government steps in, takes some action. I don't always love the framing of investors. I think it is really important that people who are landlords see themselves as suppliers of an essential service. And where we get this kind of pushback, like about, oh, well, I can't afford to do this kind of upgrade, or I can't afford to limit rent increases, or, people feeling entitled to whatever tax handout is being given to them as a landlord, the onus really does need to be turned around back onto people that you are the supplier of an essential service. And if you can't do that well, you need to think about whether you're the right person to supply housing to another person. think that's extremely reasonable. Yeah. Yeah.
Jordan, is there anything you would like to add to that?
Yeah, sure. I've got a bit of a different perspective, and this is a bit of a Georgist perspective, and I'm not a Georgist by any means, but like when you purchase a house, when you purchase land, you take away society's access to that land, and particularly in Australia where this land was never ours to take away that access to the land. But when you buy land, you take away everyone else's access to that land and you privatize the land, and then society and the state and the government or whoever it is increases the value of that land, whether that's through adding infrastructure like roads and hospitals nearby, or it's people who, open a cafe or, add culture to your area, to your suburb, and like whether or not that ends up gentrifying it or whatever, the value of your land is going to increase through the contributions of people that are not you. Like you can do nothing. You can literally, as I've been demonstrating, sit on your land, let it decay, let it rot, and the value of your land will increase from the $10,000 that you bought it in 1980 to $1.74 million today through nothing. You've done nothing. You may have put temporary fencing around it. And I think our tax system needs to adequately tax people to kind of re-socialize the value of that increase in property. If you've done nothing to increase the property, the people that did the work increasing the value of that property deserve kind of some recognition and some kind of tax incentive for increasing the value of your property that you've privatized. That is a Georgist perspective, but it's also my perspective if we can't, just take the land back and socialize it in other ways.
We've got to wrap up very shortly. I want to thank everyone for participating today. I'm really sorry we can't get to all your questions, but just a reminder for people who are interested and engaged. Maiy, can you please tell them where they can find out about the People's Commission again, one more time, please?
everybody'shome.com.au, and you can email if you want to share your experience with us as part of the commission, info@everybody'shome.com.au. We'd love to get as many stories as possible, even though they're kind of harrowing to read.
Thanks very much. And Geordie, thank you so much for your time today, everyone. We'll talk to you again soon. Thanks.
Thank you.
And that's where we'll leave this episode of Follow the Money. Thanks to Jordan van der Berg from shitrentals.org, Maiy Azize from Everybody's Home, and the Australia Institute's Senior Economist Matt Grudnoff and Deputy Director Ebony Bennett. This discussion was recorded on Tuesday the 4th of June, and things may have changed since the recording. We'd love to hear your thoughts. You can reach out to us via email at podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au. Or you can find us on Twitter at The Oz Institute with an AUS. I'm Jennifer Macy. Thanks for listening.